Lyra's eyes fluttered open, the blurry world around her slowly coming into focus. She gasped for breath, her body aching as if every inch of her was being crushed under the weight of the planet's atmosphere. The ship had crashed. She had been so sure she was dead. Yet here she was, barely clinging to life in the barren wilderness of an unknown world. The Valaks were an advanced race. Their technology far outstripped that of most species, including humans, but even the Valaks couldn't predict sabotage from within their own ranks. The explosion that had torn apart her ship had been no accident. Now, stranded and alone on a strange planet with no way to call for help, Lyra's fate seemed sealed. Her hands scraped against the rough, rocky ground as she tried to push herself up, but her body refused to obey. Blood was seeping from a gash on her side, and her legs felt like they were made of stone. In her weakened state, she could barely muster the strength to move, let alone escape. The sky above was the color of a dull bruise, dark and stormy. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder, a constant reminder that she was far from safety. It was then that she heard something, a rustling sound, soft at first, like wind blowing through the trees. But then it grew louder, coming closer. Panic shot through her veins. Had the hunters found her already? The Valak's recovery team would have tracked her ship's distress signal. They would know she was alive, and they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her. Lyra's heart raced as she tried to hide behind a pile of debris, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was approaching would pass by. She didn't have the strength to fight, not in this condition. Then the sound stopped. Her heart skipped a beat as a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby cliff. A human. At first, Lyra thought she was imagining things. Humans weren't known for their intelligence or resourcefulness, and they certainly didn't wander around dangerous alien planets. They were a primitive species, insignificant in the grand scheme of galactic affairs. The Valaks had long dismissed humans as little more than an annoyance, small, weak creatures with no place in the vast universe. But here he was. The human was tall, with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard. His clothes were dirty, worn, and covered in patches, suggesting he had been traveling for a long time. His eyes were scanning the area, alert and calculating, but they softened when they landed on Lyra. His expression shifted from suspicion to something closer to concern. Lyra's first instinct was to run. She tried to scramble to her feet, but her legs gave out beneath her. She winced in pain, biting her lip to stifle a cry. The human was approaching quickly now, and she knew she didn't have the strength to escape. "Hey," he said, his voice rough, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "Are you all right?" Lyra's eyes narrowed. Why would he help her? Humans had no reason to care for a Valaks, especially one who was so clearly a foreigner to this world. He didn't even know what she was, or who she was. She had heard that humans sometimes helped others, but she had never seen it in action. In her experience, survival was every species' first priority. No one helped anyone unless it served their interests. "I don't need your help," Lyra said coldly, her voice betraying the weakness she felt. She struggled to stand again, but the dizziness was overwhelming. She swayed, her vision blurring as a wave of nausea hit her. The human didn't back away. Instead, he stepped closer, ignoring her protests. "You look like you need more than just help," he said. "You're hurt. Let me at least get you to shelter." Lyra tried to push him away, but her arms felt heavy, like they were made of lead. The human simply grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm but not forceful. His eyes held no malice, just determination. He wasn't trying to exploit her. In fact, he seemed more worried than anything. "I'm not leaving you here to die," he insisted, his voice gentle but firm. Lyra's mind raced. What was this human's game? No one cared for another's suffering, not in this part of the galaxy. She had learned that long ago. Survival came first. Yet here was this man, offering help without hesitation. She didn't trust him, but she had no choice. Her body was betraying her, and she could no longer stand on her own. "Fine," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But if you try anything—" "I won't," he interrupted, his tone reassuring. "I just want to help." Lyra could see that there was no deception in his eyes. Reluctantly, she allowed him to lift her in his arms, holding her carefully as if she were fragile. She felt a strange mix of emotions, confusion, anger, but also something she hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. As the human carried her toward what looked like a makeshift camp in the distance, Lyra couldn't help but wonder if she had misjudged humans. Could they really be so different from the cold, calculating Valaks, or was this just another cruel twist of fate? She didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain: her life had just taken an unexpected turn. Lyra woke up slowly, the light filtering through the small tent she had been placed in. Her body still ached from the crash, but the pain had dulled, and she felt a strange warmth, both physical and emotional. She was alive, and for now, that was enough. The human, Ethan, had made her comfortable. He had cleaned her wounds, dressed them with bandages, and even started a fire outside. She could hear the crackling sound from within the tent. The smell of food reached her nose, something that smelled earthy and simple. Her stomach growled, and she realized how hungry she was. When she tried to sit up, a sharp pain shot through her side. She winced but managed to steady herself. Her vision was still blurry, but she could make out the outlines of her surroundings. The camp was basic, nothing like the technologically advanced cities she was used to back on Valak's homeworlds. The human's tent was made of rough fabric, held together by ropes and wooden poles. His gear was scattered around: tools, food, and a few weapons. Ethan had left a small bowl of food next to her. It looked like some kind of stew, thick and brown with chunks of meat floating inside. It smelled hearty, but she wasn't sure if she trusted it. Humans had strange tastes when it came to food, and she had no idea what this might be. Still, her hunger outweighed her doubts. She took the bowl in her hands, cautiously at first, and tasted the stew. Surprisingly, it wasn't bad. It was warm, comforting, and filled her with a sense of something familiar, something almost like home. When she finished, she placed the empty bowl on the ground and looked around. Ethan had been busy. A small fire was blazing outside the tent, and she could see him sitting by it, sharpening a knife. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative. He didn't seem worried about her, or about the dangers that might still be lurking around the planet. He was calm, almost as if nothing could shake him. Lyra was still confused by him. Why had he helped her? There were no signs of any other human presence nearby. Was he just a scavenger? A wanderer? She didn't understand. The humans she'd read about were not the kind to care about others. They were weak, unpredictable, and chaotic. Yet here he was, offering his help without asking for anything in return. She couldn't let herself get too comfortable. Lyra was still a long way from trusting him. She had been taught her whole life that the universe was a harsh place. People, and aliens, acted in their own self-interest. To trust someone without knowing their motives was foolish, and Lyra was not foolish. She stood up, testing her legs carefully. They were stiff, but they worked. She slowly made her way out of the tent, her eyes scanning the area. Ethan didn't look up at first, but when he did, his face softened. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Lyra didn't answer immediately. She studied him, trying to read his expression. She wanted to believe that he was different from the rest of the humans she had encountered, but the cold logic of her training told her to be cautious. She would wait. If he had a hidden agenda, she would find it. "I don't need your help," she finally said, her voice cold. "I can take care of myself." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He simply went back to sharpening his knife. His calmness was irritating. Didn't he understand how serious this situation was? "The Valaks are going to come after me," Lyra continued, trying to make him understand. "They will destroy you if they find out you've helped me." Ethan looked up again, his eyes serious but not scared. "I don't think you understand," he said slowly. "I didn't help you because I thought it would be easy. I helped you because you needed it, and I don't plan on just leaving you out here to die." Lyra was silent for a moment, weighing his words. She was still skeptical, but something about the way he spoke gave her pause. There was no fear in his voice, no sign that he had any intention of turning on her once she was no longer useful. It wasn't typical behavior for humans, and that made her uneasy. Humans were known for their survival instincts, their need to protect themselves above all else. But this man, he was different. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice softening a little. Ethan stood up and tossed the knife back into his pack. "Because," he said, "I've seen enough to know that helping others is what keeps people alive. Maybe I'm not the one who needs to be saved. Maybe you are." Lyra felt a knot form in her stomach. This human, this scavenger, seemed to believe in something that had no place in her world. In her universe, power and strength mattered above all else. There was no room for kindness or selflessness. Yet here Ethan was, offering both. She shook her head, unsure of how to respond. She couldn't trust him, not yet. But for the first time, she considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, not all humans were as she had been taught. "I'm not weak," she muttered, trying to convince herself more than anything. Ethan didn't respond, but the look in his eyes was enough. He didn't need to argue. He simply turned back toward the fire and began to prepare another meal. Lyra sat down beside him, her arms crossed, unsure of where this strange, unexpected alliance would lead. She had come here to survive, but it seemed that survival meant something very different now. She wasn't sure she liked it. The days passed slowly, and Lyra found herself growing more accustomed to Ethan's strange way of life. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, stuck on a planet with a human, surviving off scraps, and making do with whatever they could find. At first, she had resisted every offer of help, every word of advice, but something about Ethan made it hard to keep pushing him away. He wasn't like the humans she had been taught about. He wasn't cruel or selfish. He didn't see her as just another obstacle or a tool to be used. He seemed to genuinely want to help, even though she had nothing to offer him in return. But Lyra couldn't forget why she was here. Her ship had crashed because someone had sabotaged it. She had been sent to this planet not just to survive, but to be silenced. The Valak's recovery team wasn't coming to rescue her. They were coming to eliminate her, to erase any trace of the truth. If they found out she was alive, they would stop at nothing to finish the job. Ethan didn't know that. She had told him bits and pieces of her story, but the full truth was something she couldn't share with him. Not yet. She didn't trust him enough. And yet, she found herself relying on him more and more every day. It was late one afternoon when the calm they had found on this desolate planet shattered. Lyra was sitting by the fire, carefully cleaning one of the tools Ethan had found, when she heard something. A faint hum in the air, like the sound of a ship's engines. She froze, her senses immediately on alert. She looked over at Ethan, who was squatting by the fire, his back to her. "Ethan," she whispered urgently. He didn't respond right away. She watched as his fingers tightened around the knife he had been using. Finally, he turned, his eyes narrowing when he saw the look on her face. "They're here," she said, her voice low and sharp. "The Valaks. They found us." Ethan stood up quickly, his eyes scanning the horizon. The hum was louder now, growing closer. He knew they couldn't stay here. "Get ready," he said, his voice steady. "We need to move. Now." Lyra didn't need any more explanation. She grabbed her pack and slung it over her shoulder, but as she stood, a sharp pain shot through her side. She hissed, gritting her teeth against the discomfort. Ethan noticed, his gaze softening for a moment. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I can walk," she snapped, even though the pain was almost unbearable. She wasn't going to let him see her weakness, not now. She wasn't some helpless creature to be coddled. Ethan didn't argue. He was already moving toward the trees, leading the way. Lyra followed, her steps slower than usual, but she pushed herself forward. The Valaks were close, very close. As they entered the dense forest, Lyra couldn't help but glance back. The sky was darkening, and in the distance, she saw it, the unmistakable silhouette of a Valaks recovery ship, descending rapidly toward the ground. The ship was sleek and dangerous, its black hull designed for stealth. Lyra could already see the figures of the Valaks soldiers unloading from it, weapons drawn. "We need to get to higher ground," she said, her mind racing. She didn't know the terrain here well, but she knew they would be able to track her if they stayed in one place for too long. The best chance of evading the Valaks was to get them off their trail. Ethan nodded, but his jaw was clenched. "We're not going to outrun them," he said. "We'll have to make a stand." Lyra stopped walking, her eyes meeting his. For a brief moment, she saw the uncertainty in his gaze. Ethan wasn't afraid, but he wasn't sure of how to handle a fight with the Valaks either. They were superior in every way, faster, stronger, more advanced. But there was one thing they didn't understand: humanity. They underestimated it. Lyra had fought her way through many battles, but she had never fought alongside a human before. Ethan's methods were unorthodox, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made her think he knew something she didn't. He wasn't the same as the other humans who'd been part of her universe, the ones who had been ruled by the strict protocols of survival and competition. "You're right," she said after a moment. "We'll need to make a plan. Fast." They both began to move more quickly now, heading deeper into the forest. The Valaks were getting closer, but the dense trees and undergrowth provided some cover. Lyra could hear the sounds of the soldiers behind them, their voices cutting through the air in a language she didn't understand, but she could tell they were searching, closing in. Ethan stopped suddenly, his sharp eyes scanning the area. "There," he said, pointing to a small, rocky outcrop ahead. "We'll take a stand there." Lyra nodded, and they made their way toward the outcrop, positioning themselves behind rocks and trees. She could hear the Valak soldiers now, their boots crunching on the forest floor as they neared. The tension in the air was thick, and Lyra's pulse quickened. She had never been more afraid of dying, but she was more afraid of failing. "They're coming," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan nodded grimly, checking his weapon one last time. "Get ready," he said. The first of the Valak soldiers appeared, their sleek black armor glinting in the dim light. They hadn't seen them yet, but it wouldn't be long before they did. Lyra knew this was it, the moment where they either survived or didn't. They had to make it count. The air around Lyra and Ethan was tense, charged with anticipation as the Valak soldiers moved closer. She could hear the faint crunch of their boots on the forest floor, the swish of their armor as they advanced through the dense trees. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment, she felt the overwhelming weight of the situation. There was no turning back now. Lyra's fingers tightened around the blaster she had taken from her wrecked ship. It wasn't much, just a basic model, but it would have to do. She was a skilled fighter, but fighting alongside Ethan was a new experience. She had to rely on him, just as he had relied on her. They had no choice but to fight together if they had any hope of surviving. Ethan crouched next to her, his hand resting on his knife. He didn't have a blaster like Lyra, but he had something that she didn't: ingenuity. He was resourceful, quick on his feet, and had a way of thinking through problems that was completely foreign to Lyra. In that moment, she realized that she had underestimated him. He might not have the technology or the strength of the Valaks, but his mind could be just as dangerous. "They'll be on us in seconds," Ethan whispered, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "We need to act fast." Lyra nodded, her mind already working through their options. She couldn't let herself get distracted by the human beside her, no matter how much she had started to trust him. This was about survival. If they couldn't take down the Valaks, they would both be dead. A plan began to form in her mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was their only shot. "You create a diversion," she said, her voice sharp. I'll take out the first few soldiers from here." Ethan glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "You sure you can handle that?" Lyra didn't flinch. "I've fought worse." Without another word, Ethan slipped from behind a rock, moving quietly through the trees. Lyra watched him, her eyes narrowing as he worked. He moved with a kind of silent grace, using the environment to his advantage, staying hidden in the shadows. She could see him setting up something. Branches, leaves, and rocks arranged in a way that would trigger an explosion when the Valaks walked too close. It was risky, but Ethan was good at this. He had already proven that. Lyra's grip tightened on her blaster as she prepared herself for what was to come. She could hear the Valak soldiers getting closer, their voices now loud enough for her to pick out individual words. They were speaking in their harsh, clipped language, but she didn't need to understand it to know they were getting close. The first Valak soldier appeared through the trees, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Lyra waited until he was just a few steps away, then she fired. The blaster shot rang out, sharp and clear, hitting the soldier in the chest. The Valaks dropped without a sound, and Lyra quickly took cover behind a boulder. The remaining soldiers froze, their heads snapping in the direction of the shot. Lyra knew she couldn't stay hidden for long. The diversion was going to have to work. A loud crash came from behind them. Ethan's trap had gone off. The explosion was deafening, and the Valak soldiers reacted immediately, turning toward the noise. In the confusion, Lyra fired again, taking down another soldier before he could react. Ethan's voice came through the comlink in her ear, low and urgent. "I've got 2 down, but they're coming fast. We need to move." Lyra didn't hesitate. She sprinted out from her hiding spot, using the cover of the trees to dart between them. The Valak soldiers were regrouping, but they were disoriented, trying to figure out where the shots had come from. Ethan was already there, knife in hand, cutting through the next soldier who had made the mistake of getting too close. The fight was fast, chaotic, but it felt natural. In those moments, it wasn't about who was stronger or who had the better weapon. It was about survival, and they were both willing to do whatever it took. Lyra fought with precision, her training kicking in as she dropped soldier after soldier. She had been taught to fight in combat situations just like this, but fighting alongside someone else was different. It wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about Ethan's too. Ethan wasn't just a tool in her fight. He was her partner, her ally. Together, they made a terrifyingly effective team. Lyra could feel the bond forming between them, forged in the fire of battle. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, but it wasn't unwelcome. She had always been independent, relying only on herself. But with Ethan by her side, she felt stronger, like they could actually stand a chance against the Valaks. A loud roar interrupted her thoughts, and she turned just in time to see a Valak soldier charging at her. His body was armored, but his helmet was off, revealing a face twisted with rage. Lyra raised her blaster, but before she could fire, Ethan appeared out of nowhere, tackling the soldier to the ground. They struggled for a moment, but Ethan was quick. He used his weight to pin the Valak soldier down, and with a swift motion, drove his knife into the soldier's throat. The fight was over in an instant. Lyra stood there, panting, watching Ethan. Her heart was racing, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to slow. She had seen death countless times in her life, but this was different. She had never felt this, connected to anyone in battle before. Ethan wasn't just her ally. He was her savior. And maybe, just maybe, she was his too. "We make a good team," Ethan said, wiping the blood from his knife. Lyra nodded, but her gaze never left the battlefield. There were still more soldiers to deal with, and the Valaks wouldn't stop until they were both dead. But for the first time in a long while, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "We do." The battle had been fierce, but the Valak soldiers were relentless. Lyra and Ethan had managed to take down several of them, but they knew the fight wasn't over. The Valaks were not the kind to retreat easily, and soon more soldiers would be on their way. It was only a matter of time before their position was overrun. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice urgent. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, his hand still gripping the knife tightly. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were sharp, focused. "We've got to move." Lyra nodded, her breath coming in quick gasps. She felt the weight of the fight, the tension of survival, pressing down on her. But she knew Ethan was right. Staying put would be a death sentence. The Valaks would track them down and overwhelm them. "Where do we go?" she asked, glancing around the forest. The trees were dense, offering some cover, but they were no longer safe. The Valaks could already be searching for their next move. Ethan scanned the area, his eyes darting from one spot to the next. "We head toward the mountains," he said after a moment. "It's rough terrain. They won't be able to follow us as easily." Lyra felt a flicker of hope. The mountains were a difficult journey, but they were their best chance for escape. If they could make it there, they would have a better chance of losing the Valaks. "We don't have much time," she said, already moving in the direction Ethan had pointed. Her body ached from the earlier fight, but she ignored it. The pain was nothing compared to the danger that loomed over them. The two of them moved swiftly through the trees, the shadows growing longer as the day began to fade into evening. They didn't speak much as they ran, their focus entirely on making it to the mountains. Lyra could hear the distant sounds of the Valak soldiers still searching, shouting commands in their harsh language. But they weren't close. As they moved deeper into the forest, Lyra's mind raced. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had been trained for combat, for survival, but this was different. This wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about staying alive, and that meant relying on Ethan. She had never imagined herself in this kind of position, but now, with every step she took, she realized just how much she needed him. Ethan was calm, steady. He moved through the forest like he belonged there, like he had done it 100 times before. Lyra followed his lead, trusting him more than she wanted to admit. She had always relied on herself, but with Ethan beside her, there was a strange sense of balance. She didn't know how long they could keep this up, but for now, it was enough. "We should rest," Ethan said, suddenly halting and glancing over at her. "Just for a minute. We're pushing too hard." Lyra hesitated, but her body screamed for rest. Her muscles were burning and her breath was coming in ragged gasps. She didn't want to stop, not while the Valaks were still out there, but she knew Ethan was right. If they didn't rest, they would be too weak to keep running. "Fine," she said reluctantly, lowering herself to the ground beside a thick tree trunk. But only for a few minutes. Ethan didn't argue. He sat down beside her, his back against the tree, his knife still in hand, his eyes scanning their surroundings. The silence between them was comfortable for a while, but Lyra couldn't help but feel the weight of their situation pressing down on her. They had made it this far, but would they make it out alive? Would they be able to outrun the Valaks? As if reading her mind, Ethan spoke quietly. "We're going to make it," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's hard, but we've got this." Lyra glanced over at him. She hadn't expected him to say something like that. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a planner, a strategist. He had a way of keeping his cool when things were at their worst, and it made all the difference. "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice low. Ethan turned to look at her, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Because we're not giving up. And that's what counts. The Valaks might have more weapons, more soldiers, but they don't have what we do." Lyra raised an eyebrow, confused. "What do we have that they don't?" He smiled, just a little. "Each other." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Lyra felt her chest tighten. She wasn't sure what to make of them, but she knew there was truth in them. They weren't just two people thrown together by chance. They were allies, partners in this fight for survival. "Right," Lyra said, forcing a small smile. "I guess we got that." They sat there for a while longer, both of them silent as they gathered their strength. Lyra could feel the weight of their situation pressing in, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Ethan was right. As long as they kept moving, kept fighting, they had a chance. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ethan stood up, his expression serious again. "We've rested long enough. Time to move." Lyra stood up with him, feeling the ache in her body, but pushing it aside. There was no time to waste. The mountains were still ahead, and the Valaks were still behind. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm. And together, they headed into the wilderness, the mountains rising in the distance, their only hope of escaping the nightmare that had chased them this far. The journey toward the mountains had been longer and more exhausting than Lyra had anticipated. The rough terrain slowed their pace, and every step felt like it took them further from safety. Yet, despite the ache in her muscles and the constant threat of the Valaks closing in, there was something about the mountains that gave Lyra a sense of hope. If they could make it to the peaks, they might finally lose their pursuers. Ethan led the way, as always, with his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. His movements were swift, efficient, and he seemed to know exactly where he was going. Lyra, despite the fatigue pulling at her limbs, kept up with him. They were a team now, relying on each other to survive, and she wasn't about to let him down. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the temperature began to drop. The mountain air was cold, biting at their skin, and the forest grew thicker, the trees more twisted and jagged as they neared the base of the mountains. The dense underbrush made it harder to move silently, but neither of them dared to slow down. The Valaks were still somewhere behind them, closing in with every passing hour. They paused for a moment at the edge of a small ravine, their breaths heavy in the cold air. Lyra peered over the edge, noting how deep it was. A fall from here would be certain death. "I think we can climb up on the other side," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "There's a narrow ledge, but it'll give us some cover." Lyra frowned. The idea of climbing in the dark didn't sound appealing, but she trusted Ethan. He had been right so far, and she wasn't about to question him now. "All right," she said, steeling herself. "Let's move." They began their climb, using the rocks and ledges to steady themselves. It wasn't easy, and several times Lyra's hand slipped as she reached for the next hold. But Ethan was always a step ahead, guiding her, keeping her focused. He had a way of moving that seemed almost instinctual, as if he had spent his whole life navigating treacherous landscapes like this. After what felt like hours, they reached the top of the ravine, exhausted but alive. The mountain ridge stretched out before them, the snow-capped peaks rising high into the sky. It was a beautiful sight, but Lyra didn't have time to admire it. They still had a long way to go, and the Valaks were never far behind. "We need shelter," Ethan said, looking around at the harsh landscape. "We can't keep moving through the night. The cold will drain us faster than the Valaks will." Lyra agreed. They couldn't afford to be caught in the open after dark. They needed to find a place to rest and regroup. Ahead of them, a narrow cave entrance appeared, hidden by a cluster of rocks. Ethan motioned for Lyra to follow him, and they carefully approached the cave. It was small but deep enough to provide some shelter from the wind. Inside, the air was warmer, and the shadows of the trees outside barely reached in. "We'll stay here for the night," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "We can rest, get our bearings, but we need to keep watch." Lyra nodded, dropping to the ground and stretching her aching limbs. Her eyes stayed alert, but for the first time in hours, she allowed herself a moment of rest. Ethan was right. If they kept pushing themselves like this, they would both collapse before they ever reached the heart of the mountains. As she sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of the cave, Lyra found herself thinking again about the strange bond that had formed between her and Ethan. She had never trusted anyone so completely before, not even her own people. But with him, there was something different. She didn't have to explain herself or her past. He understood the need for survival, for pushing through the pain. But that didn't mean she could tell him everything. "You all right?" Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts. Lyra looked up to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. She had gotten so lost in her own thoughts that she hadn't noticed how he was studying her. "I'm fine," she replied, forcing a smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" he asked, sitting down across from her. Lyra hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She had been keeping the truth from him for so long, about the Valaks, about why she had been sent to this planet. She wasn't sure if she could tell him the full story, but something inside her told her that he deserved to know. "The Valaks aren't just after me because I'm a survivor," she began, her voice low. "They're after me because of what I know, what I've seen." Ethan raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "They want to stop me from exposing the truth," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground. "The Valaks are planning something. Something that could destroy entire worlds. My people tried to stop them, but I was the only one who made it out." Ethan's face softened, and he leaned forward. "You're not alone in this, you know. Whatever they're after, we're going to make sure they don't get it." Lyra met his eyes then, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. In that moment, she realized that he wasn't just an ally or a companion. He was more than that. He was someone who truly understood what she was fighting for. A silence fell between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Lyra felt a small flicker of warmth in her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The night passed slowly, but it was quieter than it had been for days. The cave offered them some protection, and they took turns keeping watch, making sure no Valak soldiers were tracking them through the mountains. By the time morning came, they were both ready to move again. "Let's go," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the ridge beyond the cave. "We're close now." Lyra stood, her legs stiff, but her resolve stronger than ever. Together, they would face whatever awaited them in the mountains. And no matter what, they would keep moving forward. The mountains loomed before them, their jagged peaks cutting through the sky like silent sentinels. Lyra and Ethan had made it farther than she ever thought possible, but the road ahead was still treacherous. The Valaks weren't far behind. She could feel the danger lingering, like a storm on the horizon. Ethan looked out over the snowy landscape, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "We're almost there," he said, though his voice didn't carry the usual certainty. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, blanketing the mountains in a thick layer of white. They were no longer just trying to outrun the Valaks. They were preparing to face them, to make a stand. Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the rocky path ahead. The mountain pass was narrow, and there was no easy way out. If the Valaks came for them here, they'd be trapped. But it was their only option. She had no choice but to trust in Ethan's plan. They had agreed to make one final push. They would find the location they had been searching for, a hidden facility deep in the mountains where they could learn the full extent of the Valaks' plans. If they could reach it, they might be able to stop the Valaks from destroying entire worlds. But getting there would require facing the soldiers who had been hunting them for days. "I'm not going to make it easy for them," Lyra muttered under her breath, tightening her grip on her blaster. Her hands were still sore from all the fighting, but she wasn't going to let that stop her. Not now. Ethan gave her a quick glance. "We've been through worse. Just stick to the plan." Lyra met his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settled between them. There was no going back now. They had no more time to waste, no more time to think about what could happen if they failed. "We move on 3, Ethan said. He glanced at her to make sure she was ready. Lyra took a deep breath, nodding. She was as ready as she would ever be. 1, Ethan began, his voice steady. 2, Lyra added, checking her weapon again. 3. Without another word, they began to climb the narrow pass. Every step was a calculated risk. The snow and ice made the ground slick, and the wind howled in their ears. Yet with each step, they grew closer to their goal, each step bringing them nearer to a final confrontation with the Valaks. As they moved, Lyra could hear the faintest sound, distant but unmistakable. The heavy thud of boots crunching through snow, the metallic clink of armor. The Valaks were here. She motioned to Ethan, and the two of them ducked behind a rock formation. Peering around it, Lyra saw them, a small group of Valak soldiers, their alien eyes scanning the pass ahead of them. They hadn't noticed Lyra and Ethan yet, but it wouldn't take long. "This is it," Ethan whispered. "We make our stand here." Lyra nodded, a sense of finality settling over her. She had been running from this moment for so long. Now it was time to fight. "On my mark," Lyra said, her voice low and controlled. Ethan didn't say anything. He simply nodded, eyes locked on the advancing soldiers. He knew what was coming. Lyra counted in her head, waiting for the perfect moment. The Valak soldiers were close now, too close. She didn't have any more time to wait. "Now," Lyra shouted, leaping out from behind cover. In an instant, the snow around them erupted into gunfire. Lyra fired first, hitting one of the Valak soldiers square in the chest. Ethan was right behind her, his knife flashing as he took down the second soldier with brutal efficiency. But the remaining soldiers were quick to react, diving behind rocks and firing back at them. The fight was fast, chaotic. Lyra kept her focus, her every move calculated. She dodged behind cover, firing at the soldiers as they tried to flank them. Ethan was beside her, moving with precision, his every action a testament to his survival skills. But the Valaks weren't going down easily. Their armor was tough, and their weapons were powerful. For every soldier Lyra and Ethan took down, another seemed to take their place. The snow around them was stained with blood, and the air was thick with smoke from the blasts. "Keep pushing," Ethan yelled, his voice barely audible over the noise. "We're almost there." Lyra didn't need to be told twice. She pressed forward, using the terrain to her advantage, taking out another soldier. The Valaks were falling back now, regrouping to try and get a better angle. But Lyra and Ethan weren't about to let them. Then, suddenly, Lyra saw it. The hidden facility, a small entrance built into the mountain, almost invisible behind a curtain of snow and rock. It was their only chance. "We need to move," she shouted to Ethan, gesturing toward the entrance. Ethan didn't hesitate. He nodded, motioning for her to lead the way. They sprinted toward the entrance, their breaths ragged in the freezing air, their legs burning with exhaustion. But they couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they reached the entrance, Lyra could hear the Valak soldiers regrouping behind them. The moment of truth had arrived. They had no more time for hesitation. Inside, they were met with silence. The facility was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of emergency lights along the walls. They quickly found cover inside, their weapons raised, ready for whatever came next. "We're in," Lyra said, her voice hoarse. "Now, let's end this." Ethan didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was all the confirmation they needed. The battle wasn't over, but this was their chance to stop the Valaks for good. Together, they would fight, no matter what.